Okay, the final three presentations for the Waste Symposium for 2021. I'm very excited. I don't know about you, but this is my favorite part of a conference. This is where we see the best of the best. We see the attendees with the most enthusiasm, the presenters with the most resilience. It's the final sprint, and I'm excited to be here with you all. We've got three excellent presentations now to get us to the home stretch. And then onwards to networking, weekend plans, and whatever it is that you do in your regular lives. So our first presentation is on climate adaptation from the Technical Director Environment from GHD. It's Carol Muzyk, and Carol is an environmental scientist and land use planner with experience working in South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, and the Northern Territory. She was involved in a project to implement and deliver a coastal climate risk assessment management tool, and was elected as a member of the City of Playford and understands the workings of local government councils. So bringing in a whole range of different perspectives and relevant contexts. Can I please get you to make Carol feel incredibly welcome?
Thank you for that introduction. I hope she doesn't set me up for failure. I'll try and keep you all enthralled this afternoon. So I'd just like to introduce also, I have Terry Widdowson here with me. We're from GHD. I'm relatively new to GHD. In fact, I arrived here in Darwin at the end of March from South Australia. I am kind of a returning Northern Territorian, I feel, in some ways. I did spend my teenage years, my formative years in the Northern Territory, so it's very nice to be back. So this all came about, Terry and I, both being fairly new to GHD, paid a visit on Peter and Meredith from Elgant a couple of weeks ago, and we heard about the forum that occurred on Wednesday, and we also heard about the symposium today, and were invited to come forward and do a presentation. So I got the short straw to do the presentation. So here we go now. Is it the red button that I press? The green one, of course, green means go. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of background before I get to climate adaptation for local government councils, because I'm kind of like setting a little bit of a scene here about how I came to looking at climate adaptation in local government. So my background was I originally started off with the South Australian EPA. My first role at the South Australian EPA was to compile a landfill register and checklist of all the landfills across the whole state of South Australia. That included the historical landfills that have been around since 1836, when South Australia was first established. So I was basically given a set of car keys, a list of council contacts, a list of licensed facilities that we knew we had, and to go out and find out where all these landfills were. Now, at that time, when I started at the South Australian EPA, it had become the independent EPA. It was the first year they became independent. They had previously been seen as a toothless tiger, and so there was pretty much a very poor reputation of the South Australian EPA among local government, and also among local government employees particularly as well, because we were basically never seen. Heard of a lot, but never seen. And so to go out there and talk with local government people, there was a little bit of skepticism to start off with, but I managed to form some very strong relationships with the people that I worked with. And so we compiled the landfill register. We got local government councils helped me to find out where all their landfills were within their council areas. I also put together a bit of a checklist, and the purpose of that checklist was to assess what is the current status of some of those landfills. As you can imagine, many of them were prior to the South Australian EPA, so they were never licensed sites. They were holes in grounds, they were trenches, they were sides of hills, they were in sand dunes, they were in the middle of forests, they were in sinkholes, they were everywhere. There were literally over 1,000 of these sites in various states of closure, non-closure, whether they were legal or not legal. So it was quite a big job to put forward to put that together and to have a look at what was happening in those council areas. Illegal dumping was also a big, huge issue as well. And so we set about getting a bit of an idea of where all these landfill sites were and put a checklist together to assess them, to find out how bad they were, because the next step was how to address that issue. And that's what we moved forward on. So we went to the good, the bad, and the ugly of landfills. I had a really firm understanding where all the dump sites were, and many of them were dump sites across the whole of South Australia. I then became a licensed coordinator, And through that process as a licence coordinator, again, there was another bit of an issue. We had licensed facilities with conditions that really didn't mean an awful lot. And so when I went out on my sites and I was auditing these sites against the licence conditions, many of them weren't fit for purpose. So I used it as an opportunity to review and amend the licence conditions. The other thing that I also found out as I was going around these sites was that there was a lot of education that needed to happen in terms of how to manage a landfill site appropriately. At that stage, most of the sites were given to usually the infrastructure managers and the work services crew. And at that stage, they were still pretty much dig a hole, put the rubbish in, cover it over. And that wasn't always happening. And at that stage too, waste depots were the last thing that you needed to worry about as a council. So what we did is I put together an audit procedure. I worked with local government councils. I found out what the issues were with the management and operation of these sites. The Local Government Association of South Australia, the Waste Management Association and the EPA all got together, and we ran a number of roadshows and workshops to train landfill operators, to help them to understand or to help them to manage their sites more appropriately to ensure that they were compliant with their licence conditions. But it also gave us an opportunity to hear what some of the issues and the concerns were across South Australia as well. And it's quite interesting in the last couple of days that Terry and I have been here. Many of the issues that you've got here in the Northern Territory were the things I used to see on the Eyre Peninsula and the Yorke Peninsula in South Australia. That whole issue of the tyranny of distance and not being able to get your resource recovery operators out to those facilities. So this whole landfill register gave me the opportunity to have a bit of an understanding of the volumes of waste that were out there. We had many, many decades of stockpiled scrap metals, for instance. We had tyres, we had oils, we had all sorts of things that were just being stockpiled around many of the sites. And so working with some of the recyclers around South Australia, knowing where all these sites were, knowing what the volumes of waste were, we were able to coordinate the pickup of scrap metal. We were able to coordinate someone to go around and shred the tyres. And so we're gradually starting to reduce those stockpiles down. Now, the big message that I want to give you here, that was the EPA, the Local Government Association, councils and the Waste Management Association all working together. We identified what the problem was and we came up with solutions. And I think that's the message that Terry and I have been hearing the last 3 days is, you know what the problems are, what are you going to do about it? What's the next step? And I'd like to think that there would be some workshops that you can sit down together and nut these problems out, come up with a strategy, come up with some actions, collaborate together, come up with some defined timelines. And if it means that you've got to look for federal funded money and territory government money, at least you've got a bit of an idea of what the costs are going to be to clean up some of these sites. We also then, at that stage, the South Australian EPA went through changing its guidelines for how you could manage and operate landfills. And as a result, many of the landfills closed. There was a rationalisation across the whole state of South Australia. It caused a lot of problems among the community. It's actually quite interesting how people took ownership of their dump. They were places that you went on a Saturday and Sunday and took materials out at that particular time. So when the EPA were coming in and saying, we want to close your dump down, there was quite a concern among the community of how dare they do that? So it was quite a long process. Again, the EPA engaged some consultants to come in and talk about regional waste management strategies. And we did a lot of research into where those landfills were, using that register that I had produced earlier. Where were those landfills? What were the environmental concerns? Which ones we could close down? We also looked at regional centres in terms of how far away people had to travel to go to their landfills. And we also looked at the resource recovery side. And if you look at South Australia now, I won't say we've solved all the problems, we've still got a long way to go. But I wanted to mention that to you today because I can see that you're on the path. You've got some really good intel in this room. You've got people that do know what the problems are. It's about now bringing all that together. And I really do believe, and I think Terry has also been making it very clear to people today, what is your next step? And I think those workshops, putting together some actions, and going as a united front to the territory government to try and get those things resolved is what you need to do. So that's a little bit about me and what I did. My introduction to South Australians, to waste management was initially in South Australia. I was very lucky where I was elected as a board member on the Northern Adelaide Waste Management Authority. The Northern Adelaide Waste Management Authority is a regional subsidiary formed under the Local Government Act of South Australia. It's formed by 3 councils, City of Salisbury, City of Playford and the town of Gawler. They've done some amazing work. Google Norma, they do some great stuff. They do the curbside pickup. We have a general waste bin, we have a yellow recycling bin, and we have a green waste bin. They do some great stuff there. They also have a fantastic community education and engagement program. They go into schools. They use Norma, this lady with this funny green wig, goes into the schools and talks to the kids about recycling. So it was great to hear one of the presentations earlier today about what has been happening here in the Northern Territory about educating kids. We certainly have seen some really big differences in the recycling effort in South Australia because of the work that Norma were doing going into schools and educating those kids, because they are definitely a nice little army that will help you to do that. One of the other messages that I came out through today too, and one of the earlier speakers also spoke about it, we're very big about resource recovery, but we're not thinking about the other 2 things that are at the top of the waste hierarchy, and that being reduce and recycle. And I don't know if you can see that little picture here, but that's my 27-year-old son. He's grabbed those cans and created a Christmas tree out of it. It's a little bit of a funny thing to be doing, but there are many things that you can do to reduce the amount of waste that you use, but there's other things you can do for reuse as well. I've put this one as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but I think we need to start thinking a little bit more through our community education about reducing the amount of waste we produce in the first place, but looking at other ways we can reuse it. You can use it in art. There's some amazing, wonderful examples of where artists have come out and they've reused certain items. And so, yeah, having a bit of an education program about reducing and reusing. So it was really great to have that presentation earlier today in the schools, talking to the kids, but we also need to focus about this with the community education about reducing the amount of waste we produce in the first place, but also reusing it wherever we can. One of the other areas I'd like to talk about was when I left South Australia, I went to the eastern states and I had an opportunity to work on legacy landfills. As many of you know, a legacy landfill is a landfill that doesn't have the engineered controls in place. And this is a prime example of a legacy landfill. As you can see there on the left-hand side, that is an area just south of the Sydney CBD. It's an old clay pit. To the top left-hand corner, there is the brick kilns. They're still there. They're heritage listed. It looks a little bit like craters on the moon, if you look up close enough. That's the old clay pits. So many of the buildings around the city of Sydney actually were actually made from bricks, which were sourced from the clay from this site. So that was it was actually owned by the Crown Land at the time. It was then handed over to the then South Sydney Council, who used it as a municipal landfill. All of Sydney's waste used to go in those holes. Some of those holes are up to 30 metres deep and they're dotted all over the site. There's all sorts of things that were buried in there, building and demolition waste, whole trucks, car bodies. There's actually even an elephant buried in there. So that's where all Sydney's waste went. When they closed the site, and you can see on the top right-hand side, that's Sydney Park as it is today. It's now a very large recreation facility. People use it. It's got some amazing wetlands, a series of wetlands on there for stormwater recycling. They've created into a lovely little ecosystem. There's some beautiful bird life going there. But unfortunately, in about 2012, just south of that site, when the government road infrastructure were coming in to build a highway down the bottom of it, groundwater monitoring showed that there were high levels of ammonia in the groundwater, and they traced it back to that Sydney Park site. That led to some further investigations, and of course from that, as you can imagine, being a former landfill, it was a toxic soup of groundwater underneath it. The other issue that came about, we installed groundwater, we also installed landfill gas bores around the site. And in 2018, it was found that the landfill gas levels on the border of that site were above the EPA guidelines. And there was a concern that the landfill gas might start going into the apartment buildings that surrounded that site. There was a huge issue. And so I was brought in as the project officer to manage that site. It was declared a regulated site under the New South Wales legislation, and that council is currently going through a process to remediate that site. It's a very, very long process to go through under that list. So that's in a nutshell of what the City of Sydney now needs to do. In a very similar one, this is Foxglove Oval. It's another council that I work with in South Australia. This again was originally a clay quarry pit. It was backfilled with municipal waste, turned into a soccer field. Hornsby Shire Council brought me in, and I'm allowed to say all this because it is all public knowledge. We have issues now with, as you can see, those nice little red and yellow dots all the way around that site. Issues again with landfill gas potentially going off site. And just recently it was found that the landfill gas had gone into houses to the top of that site, and 4 houses have since been evacuated in the past 2 months. GHD were engaged by me when I worked at the City of Sydney to do the landfill gas monitoring and to do the groundfall monitoring. They were also engaged by me to do this site as well. So what I'm trying to sort of say here is I've got a very long history of waste management, both at an operator level, but also at a remediation level here too. And I've got Terry here. Terry is also, he's our Technical Director of Site Contamination and Remediation. So there's a lot of experience within GHD in terms of finding out what the causes are, or what the root problems are for your landfill sites around the Northern Territory. We can build on the experiences that we've got from the work we've done interstate. I'm not going to say we've got all the solutions for you because I know we don't. However, I think we can start steering you in the right direction to get you all working together to be able to resolve some of the issues that you've got, because these are sites that do cause serious issues. And maybe at this point, you're not quite there seeing what the aftermath can be from a very poorly managed site or a historical site that hasn't been monitored. This is the sort of thing that can happen. So what I was asked to come and talk to you about today was climate adaptation for local government councils. And I'm going to give it a bit of a landfill swing as well. And there's a reason for that. So, sorry, my little laptop decided it's going to turn its little brain off for a moment. So this is building on some more work that I did in the space of climate change. It's another area that I have quite a passion for. So back in 2009, the Australian Government Office of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency commissioned a report called Climate Change Risks to the Australian Coast. It was the first pass assessment report that looked at the impacts of coastal erosion and sea flood inundation on all our coastal areas around Australia. It only focused obviously on those coastal areas. So the first pass report found that approximately $41 to $63 billion worth of property were at risk of being damaged between now and 2100 as a result of coastal erosion and sea flood inundation. In 2018, a company that I was doing some work for at the time called XDI. You can Google XDI. They've got some fantastic work that they do in the space of climate change adaptation. They commissioned a second report where they looked at the impacts of climate change on the whole of Australia. And they didn't just focus on coastal erosion and coastal inundation. They also focused on extreme heat, extreme wind, soil subsidence from the shrinking and cracking of clays, forest fire, wind and extreme temperature. And what they did is, I keep pressing the wrong button here. So they were the 5 key things that they looked at. They mapped every single postcode around Australia. So they didn't just focus on the coastal areas. And this is the distribution of what the climate change risks are for Australia between now or this is in 2100. Now, the good thing for the Northern Territory, as you can see, you're in the blue, except for some bits up the top there. most of the issues are on the eastern side of Australia. But I mention this because there's some really great work that they've done and some fantastic tools which we at GHD are building upon. What we're able to do is we're able to look at what we're suggesting you can do is look at those areas in your council that have got these medium to high risks. What council assets have you got in those areas that are likely to be affected by climate change? So this little program, and there's many other programs that do very, very similar things, is we look at the individual components that an asset is structured of, because we know under different climate change events, extreme heat, flood, wind, various components of a structure will fail over various periods of time. And so the computing power and the way they do this is they actually work out over at what point in time that asset is actually going to fail as a result. And so when you're looking at your assets, your council assets, they're the sorts of things that you need to think about with your long-term financial planning and the lifetime of your assets. And so what they've now got, so that's basically what it does. It breaks down the individual components. As you can see there, some of you can't read that up the back, but that's breaking down the individual components of a particular house. In this case, this is a building, and it looks at, of those components, how much of it is going to break down as a result of those, in this case, we've got 4 up there, 4 climate change hazards. When is it going to fail? And so when they looked at it across the whole of Australia, they found that there were actually over 383,000 addresses in Australia that are already high-risk properties now because of climate issues. By 2100, with the changes that we're going to be having, we're going to have increased heat, we're going to have sea level rise, we're going to have increased frequency and severity of some of our storm events. By 2100, that over doubles. Now, this is only looking at high-risk properties. I'm talking about dwellings here. I'm not talking about your council infrastructure because that's another whole different level. So what we can do, and what LG Adapt is, which is a program that has been developed, is we can look at what the impact is going to be on your individual council assets. And by using the program, and I'm just flicking through some of these, the individual assets that it can look at are council buildings, wastewater treatment plants, airports, gasworks, ports, power stations, railway bridges, tunnels, platforms, roads, telecommunication towers, water treatment plants, and now landfills. I don't have enough time here today to go through the whole lot and how it all works, but there is this technology out there that is now available to local government councils, and I do suggest at some point, at the moment I know you're all dealing with landfills per se, but at some point you need to think about the impacts of climate change on your council assets. And just by way of an example, this is a landfill here in the Northern Territory, and when I run it through the system, at the moment, it's got a low risk. 1990 it had low risk 10 years ago, but by 2100, it's going to have a moderate risk. It's going to be affected by climate change. And for this particular landfill, it's going to be affected by soil movement. Now, can you imagine what's going to happen with particularly an engineered landfill? If you've got soil movement happening, what's going to happen to your leachate liner? What's going to happen to your leachate collection system? What's going to happen to your landfill gas system? Are you going to start finding because of the soil movement that your landfill cover is actually going to fail, and you're going to start seeing your landfill gases coming out through the top? Soil movement is a big problem for landfills. This is a closed landfill. I ran it through the system. It is already in big trouble. And this particular one is in trouble as a result of forest fire. So it's in an area where there potentially is going to have probably very high incidence due to the vegetation that's around it, a high incidence of forest fires occurring in that area. Now, any of you that know about the Ash Wednesday fires that occurred in South Australia in the mid-1980s, that started from a subterranean landfill fire. And the council really got in trouble, a lot of trouble over that one. Unfortunately, the fire had been burning for quite some time underground and it had come to the surface. Now, I have gone to a number of landfills that do have subterranean landfill fires. often, or the ones that I came across, had been caused because somebody had either decided to burn the top layer of waste and it's been extinguished, but they've not realised it's actually burning underground. There's one particular case where I was standing in the middle of the Eyre Peninsula. We'd gone over there as part of the disaster recovery after the Ash Tuesday, of the Black Tuesday fires in 2005, which is something else I'll talk about in a moment. We've gone over there because we needed to know where to put the livestock waste, the building waste, and so because they were mostly my sites that I managed, I was sent over there. While we were over there, one of those subterranean landfill fires came to the surface while my boss and I were standing there. And it turned out it was because somebody had delivered some hot ashes to the site. The landfill operator thought that they had extinguished it, but did not realise that it had actually started burning underneath the waste. So landfill fires are a real issue. Subterranean landfill fires are an enormous issue because often you don't know that they're actually burning until they come to the surface. And they do cause all sorts of issues as a result. So forest fire around landfills is an issue. So that was a closed landfill that I showed you. What I would also suggest is if you're looking at building new landfills, you need to run this lens over it. You need to look at what are the potential climate change impacts on that landfill. What's it going to happen by 2100? Is it going to be in an area that's likely to have high fire risk? Is it in an area where there's going to be a lot of soil movement? Or is it in an area where there is the possibility that there will be coastal inundation or riverine inundation? So that planning element of it comes in quite strongly as well. We need to think about that. This is a council building. It's actually in Adelaide. When I ran it through the system, it has some issues as well, and those issues are from extreme wind. So at some point in time, that building is going to fail. This is a wastewater treatment plant. It's actually in the Northern Territory. Now, I believe my understanding is here in the Northern Territory, councils aren't responsible for community wastewater treatment plants. Would that be right? Is that correct? Yeah, because in South Australia they are. And so this wastewater treatment plant, although it says 1990 on the left-hand side, basically it is already subject to riverine flooding. It must be happening already from time to time. Now, it might happen in a 1 in 100-year event, but those 1 in 100-year events obviously get more, over a period of time, get more significant and more frequent. And so that's what happens with that particular site. So I've given you a little bit of a snapshot of the sorts of things and what my history is, what my background is. I've worked very strongly with local government in New South Wales, South Australia, Queensland, and here in the NT. I was also an elected member at the City of Playford for a period of 4 years. So when it comes to how local government operates, I think I've got a pretty firm idea. We are very strong in the waste management field at GHD. You've just heard about what my background is. There is quite a number of other officers, including Terry that's here with me today. We've got a whole list of talents behind us, but these are the sorts of things that we can offer you in the waste management space. We can do environment impact assessments. We can do them now on all your sites. We can help you with your landfill and waste transfer station design. We can do your landfill environmental management plans and your closure plans. We can also look at your legacy landfills, and that's the work that I did with the City of Sydney and Foxglove Oval, and Terry has also been working on some sites, I believe, here in Northern Territory as well. We can do site contamination and remediation. We can also help you with your waste management strategies and, more importantly, your action plans. Some of the comments that came out on Wednesday were talking about strategies. I'm not for making glossy brochures that just sit on the shelf. I'm about action plans. If you're going to have a strategy, it's got to have an action, it's got to have a timeline, and it's also got to have a budget associated with it as well. Otherwise, forget it. It's just a waste of paper. So we can do those plans for you to do. The other thing that I think we can do, or I know we can do, because I have done it before, is the stakeholder engagement. And that's facilitating your workshops, bringing you all together, local government, your resource recovery operators, possibly even some of the state government agencies as well, bringing you all together to help you move towards this path of resolving the issues that you've currently got. You're on the way. I think you're doing some amazing work here in the NT. I've only been here for a very short period of time, but what I've seen, you're doing a great job. Hopefully, we can help you move that a little bit further forward. But I think it's definitely about now you've identified what the problems are. What are you going to do now in terms of finding the solutions and moving things forward for your community? So that's me. I've obviously well underdone my 30 minutes. It's a Friday afternoon. Please feel free to contact me at any time. You can Google me. There's only 2 Carol Muzyks in the world. One's in the US and one's here. So Google me, you'll find me. Terry, I asked Terry, you would like to come up? Come up here. You have to come by the microphone.
Just very quickly on the landfill stuff. I know some of you may be a bit sceptical about climate change. Hopefully not many. Climate change is happening. It is real. It is here. It's not going away. Just as an example, unfortunately, it's not an Aussie example. I'm an Aussie's worst nightmare. I'm a Pommy with a Kiwi passport, and so I spent some time in New Zealand when I'm not in Darwin. The year before COVID, some of you may have seen it on the news. The year before COVID, and I've forgotten even what that year was now, but there was a major storm event on the west coast of New Zealand, and it went through one of the rivers near the glaciers down on the west coast, and there was a landfill which had been placed in some old gravel workings on the side of the river, which had been there for decades, and hardly anybody knew about it, and it hadn't caused a problem. And this huge flood event came through and wiped out the whole landfill and washed all of the landfill down the river and caused a massive amount of pollution, which took months to clean up. It involved lots of local people volunteering their time. The army got involved. It was a massive cleanup, just on the basis of one legacy landfill being washed away in one storm event. In this case, it was a pristine part of New Zealand, which is why it caused a big uproar. There's also similar examples happening on New Zealand coastlines with coastal erosion. Landfills are being washed into the sea. We've got other situations where rivers eroding away landfills that are on riverbanks. It's happening now. The New Zealand government was so concerned about this that they're funding a national project to look at all legacy landfills in the country so they can be mapped and classified, so that then we can form action plans to sort them out. So it's a real issue that governments elsewhere are taking seriously. So I would strongly suggest that you guys and NT government get together and really think about this. That's just what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Were there any questions?
I just wanted to know, can we actually move away from landfills? You know,
That's certainly what we were doing in South Australia. We significantly reduced the amount of landfills that we had by turning them into transfer stations. It was a gradual process. And as I said during part of my presentation, one of the issues we had initially was the community uproar, because they didn't like the idea of it. It was their dump. It was their waste. They didn't want it closed down. So those old trench-style landfills, people take ownership of them. They feel that they're part of, for whatever reason, that was a big issue to start with. But you can. There's ways you can do it. And that was the work that we did on the Eyre Peninsula. And using that landfill register that I spoke about very earlier, we could actually look at where all those old sites were and start rationalising which ones could we close down. At the top of the list were the ones that had the highest environmental impacts that we knew we had to close because they were causing issues. And then we gradually worked down. So we worked with local government to try and rationalise where was the best place to put a regional landfill, a regional engineered landfill. But part of that was also about, well, if you close down our landfill and you turn it into a waste transfer station, what does that waste transfer station look like? And how do you go about sorting your wastes? And part of that was through the community education. We actually were allowing people, if you can actually educate people to sort their waste before they come to the transfer station, it works a lot easier. Having your transfer station set up so it's very, very easy for people to see where each waste goes. Having your resource recovery centres, and Northern Adelaide Waste Management Authority has got an absolutely amazing resource recovery centre. When you rock up there in your car, you know exactly where all your waste needs to go. And there's various other examples across that, not just in South Australia, but other places I've seen as well. So you can close your landfills down. You do need to turn them into resource recovery or waste transfer stations, because people do not want to travel long distances if you don't have a curbside pickup, which I understand you wouldn't have here in the Northern Territory. You've got to make it easy for people. And so there's a lot of work and planning that goes into that, and it's that rationalisation. It's that working how you can pick up all those
recyclable wastes, but it's also community education as well. And certainly there's some expertise within GHD that we can help you with that.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Well, could we please thank Carol for her presentation?